going?
I'm going to heaven now.
Scoot back now.
Y'all stand back.
This is one of those spells? You think this is a spell?
This is God's will.
It begins in the quietest place imaginable, a family home, a place meant to hold warmth, laughter, and safety. But sometimes it becomes the stage for something unspeakable, when the hands meant to hold love instead bring death. When we think of monsters, we imagine strangers. We think of shadows lurking outside, of doors that need locking, of danger that comes from somewhere else. But the stories you're about to hear remind us that sometimes the horror is already inside. Sometimes the danger has your last name. These are not tales of hardened criminals or lifelong killers. They are stories of sons and daughters, teenagers who turned against the very people who gave them life. Some claimed rage, some claimed mercy, some claimed nothing at all. The question that echoes through every case is why? Why does a child, still growing, still learning, turn on their parents? Is it madness, hatred, or something deeper, darker? A coldness that lives beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it decides to take over? Across the years, these stories have haunted small towns and filled courtrooms with disbelief. Police officers who walked into blood-stained kitchens, reporters who stood outside family homes now surrounded by tape. None of them could make sense of what they saw, because there are crimes that defy reason, and then there are crimes that destroy it. You'll hear about the boy who killed his mother before walking into his school with a gun, about the girl who planned her parents' murders with the boy she loved, about those who claimed mercy and those who showed none. Each one believed they were different, each one thought they had a reason, but in the end, every reason led to the same silence. These are not easy stories to tell. They are filled with contradictions, innocence and cruelty, youth and evil, love and betrayal. They force us to look at the question no one wants to ask. Can evil be born at home? And maybe the hardest truth of all is this: evil does not wait for adulthood. It can live in a teenager's smile, behind a child's eyes, inside the walls of a house where everyone thought they were safe. This is not a story of strangers. It is a story of families, of trust broken beyond repair, of the moment when love itself becomes the weapon. This is the Most Evil Kids Who Killed Their Own Parents. Luke Woodham. Every tragedy has an origin. For Luke Woodham, it began in the quiet town of Pearl, Mississippi, the kind of place where church bells rang on Sundays, where people left their doors unlocked, and the biggest worry was Friday's football game. It was the kind of town where no one expected the darkness to come from one of their own. Luke was 16 years old, quiet, heavy-set, polite to adults, and invisible to most of his classmates. He spent his days drifting between school and home, keeping to himself, nursing wounds no one else could see. He was bullied constantly, mocked for his appearance, his voice, his loneliness. He smiled in public, but in private he filled pages of a notebook with anger. He wrote about being forgotten, about hating the people who laughed at him. In one entry he said, "They don't see me, they will." His mother, Mary Ann Woodham, was a kind woman who worked long hours to care for him. She encouraged him to study, to make friends, to believe life would get better. But Luke didn't hear comfort in her words. He heard control. He began to see her as another obstacle, someone who wanted to keep him small when all he wanted was power. At night, while she slept, he imagined what freedom would feel like. Then he met Grant Boyette, a charismatic older teen who led a small group, calling themselves the Croth. They were fascinated by rebellion and Satanism, teenagers pretending to be something dangerous. For Luke, it was the first time he felt wanted. Boyette called him special. He said pain was strength, that real power came from rejecting everything that made you weak. Luke listened. He believed every word. The group fed his bitterness. They told him his mother was the chain that kept him bound. They called her the jailer. Boyette promised that if Luke truly wanted freedom, he had to destroy what he loved most. In his journal, Luke wrote, "I have tasted revenge. I feel powerful for the first time." Before dawn on a cold October morning, Luke stood in the doorway of his mother's bedroom with a butcher knife. She was still asleep when he attacked. The blade cut through silence. When it was over, he stared at her body for a long time, waiting to feel something. He felt nothing. He washed his hands, changed his clothes, and left her there. He drove her car to Pearl High School. He arrived just after 8 o'clock. Students were spilling into the parking lot, laughing, carrying books. Luke stepped from the car wearing a long trench coat. Hidden beneath it was a rifle. He raised it and opened fire. Lydia Dew fell first, then Christina Menifee. 7 others were wounded before Assistant Principal Joel Myrick retrieved his own gun and tackled Luke to the ground. The shooting lasted only minutes, but it changed Pearl forever. When police handcuffed him, Luke was calm. He said softly, "The world has hurt me, so I took it back." They thought they were dealing with a school shooter. Then they went to his house and found his mother dead on the bedroom floor. During questioning, Luke spoke in an even tone, almost polite. He told detectives he had been pushed too far. He said the Croth had shown him that life and death were illusions, that killing his mother was necessary. One investigator later said, "He talked like a preacher giving a sermon." At his trial, prosecutors painted him as manipulative and cruel, a boy who wanted fame, not freedom. They read from his journal, filled with rage, arrogance, and strange poetry. He wrote of cleansing the world and being reborn through violence. The defense argued he had been brainwashed by older teens, emotionally broken and desperate to belong. But the jury saw through the excuses. They found him guilty of murdering his mother and 2 students. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. When the verdict was read, he didn't cry. He just looked down at his hands, as though wondering how they had done so much damage. Years later, from behind bars, Luke claimed he had found God. He said he was forgiven, that he had changed. But for the families, those words meant little. One grieving father said, "He talks about forgiveness. I talk to a gravestone." Luke Woodham's rampage became one of the first school shootings to be broadcast live on national television. For weeks, news anchors repeated his name, psychologists analyzed his mind, and politicians asked what could drive a child to murder his own mother. The answers never came. In Pearl, life moved forward, but never the same. The house where Mary Ann died still stands. The new owners say it feels strange, the air too heavy, the quiet too deep. Neighbors say the light on the porch flickers every October morning, just before sunrise. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe some places remember. Luke once wrote, "Evil can live in anyone, even me." He was right. It lived in him, and it destroyed everything that made him human. He wasn't a monster from a nightmare. He was a boy from next door, and that is what makes his story impossible to forget. And while Pearl tried to heal from what one son had done, another small American town was about to face its own horror. A boy who waited until his family was asleep before pulling the trigger and erasing them all. Nicholas Browning. It happened in the kind of neighborhood people move to for peace. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, front doors left unlocked. Families trusted each other there, and in one of those houses lived the Brownings, a picture of stability. A father who coached Little League, a mother who worked at the local school, 2 sons who shared a love for video games and laughter. But one night, everything changed. And by the time the sun rose over Cockeysville, Maryland, that picture of perfection had been erased forever. Nicholas Browning was 15 years old, smart, quiet, polite, the kind of boy teachers said would go far. He earned good grades and dreamed of becoming a lawyer like his father, John Browning. To the outside world, Nicholas had everything: 2 caring parents, a safe home, a promising future. But inside, something was rotting. As he grew older, resentment began to take root. His father was strict, disciplined, and expected excellence. He pushed Nicholas to study harder, to behave better, to be stronger. Nicholas saw it not as love, but control. He wanted freedom, the kind he thought his friends had, where no one told them what to do. He began to talk about how much easier life would be without his family. At first, his friends laughed, but he wasn't joking. On a cold February night in 2008, that talk became action. His parents had gone to bed early, his 2 younger brothers asleep in the next room. The house was silent. Nicholas walked into his father's bedroom, carrying his dad's 9mm handgun. He stood there for a moment, watching the man who had raised him sleep peacefully, unaware of the danger standing in the doorway. Then he fired. Once, twice. The sound shattered the calm. His mother, Tammy Browning, awoke, confused and terrified. She never had the chance to scream before Nicholas turned the gun on her. Then he walked into the room where his younger brothers, Gregory and Benjamin, were sleeping. He shot them both as they lay in their beds. 4 bodies, 4 lives gone in less than 2 minutes. When it was over, Nicholas cleaned himself up, took the family car, and drove to a friend's house. He told them his father had been killed and that he'd come home to find his family murdered. He stayed there until morning, pretending to grieve. When police arrived at the Browning home later that day, they found a scene so brutal it left even seasoned investigators shaken. And the one person who seemed calmest of all was Nicholas. At first, his story held. He told detectives he had been out all night, that he had come home to tragedy, but the timeline didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing valuables, and no footprints except his own. After hours of questioning, Nicholas broke down. He confessed, flat, emotionless, as if describing someone else's dream. He told police he had thought about it for days. He said, "I just got tired of them telling me what to do." Investigators were stunned. He hadn't acted out of rage or impulse. He had planned it step by step. He knew where the gun was, when his family would be asleep, and how to make it look like a robbery. When asked if he regretted it, he said, "Not really. I just didn't want to get caught." In court, prosecutors described him as a calculated sociopath in a 15-year-old's body. They said he murdered for convenience, for the fantasy of freedom. The defense argued he was a child lost in rebellion, incapable of understanding the permanence of what he'd done. But the facts were too cold, too deliberate. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 4 life terms, with the possibility of parole after 50 years. He will spend the rest of his youth and most of his life behind bars. During sentencing, relatives spoke through tears. One aunt said, "We raised him, we loved him, and he took everything from us. He destroyed his own blood." Nicholas stared straight ahead, unblinking. No apology, no tears, just silence. In the years since, the case has been dissected by reporters, psychologists, and true crime shows. Everyone wanted to know what went wrong, how a boy from a good home could commit such evil. Some say it was pressure, others say it was narcissism, but maybe it was something simpler, an emptiness that no amount of love could fill. Nicholas Browning once said he wanted to be free. He got his wish, free from curfews, free from discipline, free from family, but his freedom came with bars and concrete walls, a cage of his own making. The house where the murders happened was eventually sold. Neighbors say new families have come and gone, but few stay long. They say the air feels different there, like the walls still remember the night the laughter stopped. Nicholas wrote once from prison that he still dreams about his home, but in the dream, no one speaks to him. They just look at him. The father, the mother, the brothers, silent and waiting. Maybe that is his real punishment, to spend forever haunted by the faces he chose to erase. And while Marilyn tried to make sense of how a son could destroy his entire family, another story was unfolding in Texas. A teenage girl who didn't just plan her parents' murders, but invited her boyfriend to help carry them out. Erin Caffey. Some stories begin with a scream. This one began with a whisper, the kind that says, "I love you," before it becomes, "I'll kill you." Erin Caffey grew up in a small Texas town where families prayed together, where trust was sacred, and where people believed evil came from born away. But in March of 2008, evil came from inside their own home. Erin was 16, a pastor's daughter, a girl who sang in the church choir, smiled at neighbors, and played piano at Sunday services. To anyone who saw her, she was sweetness made flesh. But beneath that smile, something darker was forming. A storm she hid behind dimples and soft words. Her parents, Terry and Penny Caffey, were strict but loving. They adored their daughter, but they worried about the new boy in her life, an 18-year-old named Charlie Wilkinson. Charlie was older, impulsive.
Loved him.
I don't know if at 16 I knew what proper love was.
And obsessed with Erin. When her parents found out they were sneaking out to meet, they demanded she stop seeing him. They took her phone, cut off contact, and grounded her. Most teenagers might have cried or rebelled. Erin decided to end it permanently. Over the next few weeks, she and Charlie began to plan the unthinkable, the murder of her family. They enlisted a friend, Charles Wade, and another girl, Bobby Johnson, promising money from her parents' safe once everyone was dead. To them, it was a game, a fantasy of love and freedom. But Erin's fantasy was about control. She wanted to be with Charlie, no matter what it cost. In the early hours of March the 1st, 2008, the group gathered outside the Caffey home. The lights were off. Inside, Terry and Penny were asleep with their two young sons, Matthew and Tyler, ages 13 and 8. Erin waited in the car, parked down the road, while Charlie and Wade crept toward the house with guns and knives. They entered, through an unlocked door. The sound of breaking glass woke Penny first. She barely had time to rise from the bed before bullets tore through the room. Terry was shot in the shoulder, then slashed with a sword as he tried to shield his wife. Penny was shot repeatedly, falling beside him. Then the killers turned toward the boys' room. Matthew tried to run. He was stabbed. Tyler hid under his blanket, calling for his mother. He was shot through the fabric. Downstairs, the killers drenched the house in gasoline and set it on fire. Flames swallowed the walls, the beds, the life the Caffeys had built together. Then they drove away. Erin sat in the car the entire time, listening to the sounds from inside her home. The screams, the gunshots, the silence. But one thing went wrong. Her father, Terry, wasn't dead. Bleeding and half blind from smoke, he crawled through the flames, dragging himself out of the burning house and into the woods. He stumbled more than 300 yards to a neighbor's house, collapsing at their door. His body was torn open, his skin burned, but his mind was clear. He said, "My family's been killed. My house is on fire." Firefighters found the remains of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler inside. The fire had reduced the home to ash. When police questioned Terry in the hospital, he whispered the one name he remembered hearing before the attack: Erin. It took less than a day for police to find her. She was staying at a friend's trailer, calm and quiet, as if nothing had happened. When officers told her her family was dead, she cried. But when they mentioned her father had survived, her face changed. She asked, "He's alive?" Not in relief, but in shock. During interrogation, she tried to play the victim. She said Charlie had forced her, that she never wanted anyone to die. But Charlie's confession told a different story. He said Erin planned everything: who would die first, what weapons to bring, even where to burn the bodies. He said she promised to marry him once it was over. The truth was undeniable. She had orchestrated the murder of her own family to be with a boy. In court, prosecutors called her ice in the shape of a girl. The judge agreed. Erin was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade received death sentences. Bobby Johnson received 40 years. Terry Caffey, the man she left to die, became the face of forgiveness. He visited her in prison, telling reporters, "Hate won't bring my family back. She's still my daughter." He even wrote a book about it, Terror by Night, describing how he survived and learned to forgive. But not everyone believed forgiveness was possible. One relative said, "She didn't just kill her mother and brothers, she killed her soul." Today, Erin Caffey sits in a Texas prison. She reads the Bible, attends church services, and still writes to her father. Some say she has changed. Others say her eyes still hold that strange calm, the calm of someone who once watched love burn. The house is gone. Nothing remains of the Caffey home but a clearing in the woods. Grass grows where walls once stood. And sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees, locals say it sounds like children laughing, a cruel echo of what was lost. And while Texas tried to understand how a daughter could become a destroyer, another Florida teenager would soon show the world what evil looks like when it parties. Tyler Hadley. It was a Saturday in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Warm, quiet, ordinary. Teenagers were texting about parties, checking their phones, and talking about nothing important. And in one small yellow house at the end of a suburban street, 17-year-old Tyler Hadley was planning something that would make him infamous. Tyler wasn't a name people feared. He was short, quiet, with a round face and a nervous smile. He loved music, video games, and hanging out with friends. But inside, he carried something heavy: anger, depression, a feeling that life was meaningless. He had been taking antidepressants, skipping school, drifting further from the boy his parents knew. His parents, Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, were good people. They worried about their son but never gave up on him. They tried therapy, boundaries, church. They still believed he would grow out of it. But Tyler didn't want help anymore. He wanted attention. He wanted control. And most of all, he wanted to do something no one would ever forget. In the days before it happened, he began telling friends he was going to kill his parents. They laughed. No one believed him. He said, "I'm having a party at my house. No parents. Trust me." They thought he was joking. he wasn't. On the afternoon of July 16th, 2011, Tyler stood in the kitchen while his mother made dinner. He walked into the garage, picked up a claw hammer, and hid it behind his back. Then he attacked her. He struck again and again until she stopped moving. His father came running, shouting his name, begging him to stop. Tyler turned on him next. When it was over, both of them were dead. He dragged their bodies into the master bedroom, covered them with towels, books, and files, and locked the door. Then he cleaned himself up, took a shower, and sent out a text. "Party at my place. Spread the word." By 9 that night, cars were lining the street. Dozens of teenagers poured into the house, laughing, drinking, dancing. Music shook the walls. No one noticed the smell, or if they did, they ignored it. Tyler moved through the crowd like a ghost, smiling, handing out beers, hugging people. He told one friend, "My parents are dead." The friend laughed. He said, "You're messed up, man." But it wasn't a joke. Later that night, Tyler pulled aside his best friend, Michael Mandel. He led him to the master bedroom. Michael thought it was another prank until he saw the dark stain on the floor and the broken frame of the bed. Then he saw the bodies. Tyler whispered, "I killed them." Michael froze, unable to move. Tyler told him not to call the police, not to ruin the party. He said, "I did it. I finally did something big." For the next few hours, Tyler stood in the middle of the chaos he had created. He took selfies, hugged people, and smiled for photos. In one picture, his eyes are wide and vacant, the kind of stare that doesn't belong to someone fully human anymore. He posted on Facebook, "Party at my house again, hit me up." When the crowd finally left, the house was destroyed. Beer cans, cigarette burns, shattered glass. Tyler sat alone in the living room, staring at the wall. He said later he felt nothing, just empty. Michael Mandel couldn't keep the secret. After leaving the party, he called Crime Stoppers. Police arrived in the early hours of the morning. They found Tyler pacing in the driveway, his hands trembling. Inside, they discovered the bodies exactly where he said they'd be. In interrogation, Tyler admitted everything. He said he had taken 3 ecstasy pills before the murders, that he wanted to be remembered forever. He said he thought about killing himself afterward, but decided to throw one last party. When asked why, he said, "I don't know, I just wanted to see what it felt like." His voice was calm, detached, the voice of a boy describing something far smaller than it really was. At his trial, prosecutors called him a narcissistic killer who had turned murder into performance. They showed photos from the party, the crime scene, the blood-stained hammer. The defense argued mental illness, saying he was unstable and delusional. But the jury saw through the excuses. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. When he heard the verdict, he didn't cry, he just nodded. Years later, Tyler wrote from prison that he regretted what he did. He said he missed his parents, that he still dreamed about them. He wrote, "They were the best parents. I'm the worst son." But for the people who knew Blake and Mary Jo, remorse came too late. They were gone, and their son had made sure their names would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The Hadley house still stands, empty and decaying, a local legend of horror. Teenagers drive by at night, daring each other to look inside. The windows are boarded, the grass uncut, but sometimes the porch light flickers, a reminder of the night the laughter turned to screams. Tyler Hadley wanted to be remembered, and he was. Not for his party, not for his friends, but for showing the world what happens when attention becomes more important than love. And while Florida was still haunted by the boy who threw a party over his parents' graves, another teenager would follow, one who didn't just kill for freedom, but for money. John Granat. In the quiet suburb of Palace Park, Illinois, Granat family was known for their kindness. They owned a small landscaping business, attended church every Sunday, and kept their home immaculate. They were the kind of family neighbors waved to, simple, honest, proud, and their only son, John, was the center of their world. But in September of 2011, that perfect picture shattered, and what police found inside the Granat home would become one of the most shocking crimes in the history of the town. John Granat was 17 years old. To everyone who knew him, he was polite, quiet, and respectful. He helped his father with work, helped his mother with groceries, and smiled when spoken to. He wasn't violent, he wasn't cruel, he was just normal. But behind that quiet exterior, something was changing. His parents, Maria and John Granat Sr., were strict. They demanded discipline, curfews, good grades, and respect. John felt smothered. He wanted freedom, but his parents controlled everything: the car, the money, the rules. When they caught him lying about where he'd been one night, they took away his phone and grounded him. He said nothing. But inside, resentment started to boil. Over time, that resentment turned into hatred, and hatred turned into a plan. John began confiding in a group of friends: Marlon Green, William Balfour, and Cherish Pristash. They were older, wilder, fascinated by violence and easy money. When John told them about his strict parents and how much cash his father kept at home, they offered a solution. They told him they'd kill his parents for him. At first, it was a joke, but soon it wasn't. John agreed. He promised to leave the back door unlocked, to make it easy. He even said he would give them thousands of dollars from his parents' savings afterward. It was a deal sealed not by desperation, but by greed. On the night of September the 10th, 2011, the plan became real. Around midnight, the killers entered through the unlocked back door. The house was quiet. The air was still. John Sr. and Maria were asleep upstairs. John Jr. waited in the basement, pretending not to hear what was about to happen. He later said the walls shook with the sound of violence. The men crept into the parents' bedroom and began beating them with baseball bats. Maria tried to run, but she was struck down. John Sr. fought back, but there were too many of them. When it was over, the room was soaked in blood. Then one of the killers went downstairs to get John. When they called him up, they handed him a knife. They told him to finish it. He said no. They threatened him. And then, standing in the same room where his parents' bodies lay broken, John bent down beside his father and slit his throat. The boy who once said "I love you" to his parents ended their lives with his own hands. The group fled the house, taking cash and jewelry. They split the money and laughed about what they had done. John went home later, pretending to discover the crime. He called 911, sobbing, screaming that his parents had been murdered. Police arrived to find him shaking, covered in fake tears. But detectives knew something was off. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing valuable was missing except the family's safe. When questioned, John's story fell apart. Within hours, he confessed. He told investigators everything: how he had planned it, how his friends had attacked, and how he had cut his father's throat. He said, "They were always yelling at me. I just wanted it to stop." In court, prosecutors described him as the ultimate betrayer, a son who traded his parents' lives for pocket change. They read his text messages, his calm instructions, his promises to his friends that the money was easy pickings. The defense tried to paint him as manipulated, weak, lost, but the evidence showed otherwise. He had opened the door, he had watched, he had killed. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His accomplices also received life sentences. None of them ever showed real remorse. During sentencing, one detective said, "It wasn't about abuse, it wasn't about desperation, it was about greed, pure and simple." For the people of Palace Park, the crime felt like a betrayal of everything they believed in. This wasn't a monster from the outside, this was their neighbor's son, the boy who mowed lawns, who smiled at church, who waved from his driveway. The Granat home stood empty for years. The lawn grew wild, the windows boarded. It became a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't come from strangers in the night. Sometimes it sleeps under the same roof. John Granat never spoke publicly again. In prison, he refuses interviews, claiming that the past is over. But for those who knew his parents, it never will be. One neighbor still leaves flowers on the property each year. She says she does it for the parents, because their son won't. The most haunting part of the story isn't the murder. It's the thought that in the hours before their deaths, Maria and John Sr. probably still believed their son loved them. Maybe they even said goodnight. Maybe they thought tomorrow would be normal again. But tomorrow never came. And while Illinois tried to make sense of a son who killed for money, another family in Texas would soon face their own tragedy. A teenage boy whose courtroom tears would divide an entire city. A.J. Armstrong Jr., Houston, Texas. A quiet gated community, the kind of place where success had built tall fences and perfect lawns. Behind one of those fences stood a house that seemed untouchable, the Armstrong home. It belonged to Antonio A.J. Armstrong Sr., a former NFL linebacker, his wife Dawn, and their 2 children. They were a family built on discipline, faith, and hard work. They had everything most people dream of, but one night in July of 2016, that dream collapsed, and it happened at the hands of their own son. A.J. Armstrong Jr. was 16. Polite, popular, and handsome, he was the kind of teenager parents pointed to and said, "That's a good kid." He went to private school, played basketball, and quoted Bible verses online. His father was proud of him. His mother adored him. But behind the smile, something darker was growing. He started skipping classes, sneaking out at night, lying about grades. His parents caught him smoking marijuana in their home. They took away his privileges, locked up his phone, and grounded him. To them, it was tough love. To AJ, it felt like control. He began to talk about how strict they were, how nothing he did was ever good enough. Friends said he started to sound angry. Not loud anger, but quiet, heavy, deliberate. On the night of July 29th, 2016, the Armstrongs went to bed as usual. AJ waited until the house was silent. Then, sometime after 1 a.m, he took his father's gun, a .22 caliber pistol, from a kitchen drawer and walked upstairs. He stopped outside his parents' bedroom door. Inside, his mother and father slept, unaware that their son was standing there in the dark, breathing heavy, gripping the weapon. Moments later, 2 gunshots tore through the night. One bullet struck his father in the head. The other hit his mother as she tried to rise from the bed. She collapsed to the floor, whispering his name. Downstairs, their daughter Kyra screamed. She was only 12. She called 911, terrified, saying she heard gunshots and thought someone was in the house. AJ picked up the phone seconds later, pretending to be calm. He told dispatchers there was an intruder. When police arrived, they found the parents dead and the house still warm with the smell of gunpowder. AJ stood in the kitchen wearing no shirt, trembling, but his story didn't fit. There was no forced entry, no broken windows, no signs of a struggle, and the gun, the same one used in the murders, was lying on the counter, still smoking. At first, investigators didn't want to believe it. The idea that this well-behaved, charming teenager could do something so cold was unthinkable. But the evidence pointed only one way. Gunpowder residue was found on his hands. His fingerprints were on the weapon, and security footage showed no one else entering the home. When confronted, AJ cried and denied everything. He said, "I didn't do this. Someone broke in. They killed my parents." Detectives asked who. He said he didn't know. They asked how. He had no answer. The case went to trial, not once, but 3 times. The first 2 ended in mistrials after juries couldn't agree on a verdict. His defense team claimed he was being framed, that the investigation was flawed, that perhaps his father's business had made enemies. But by the 3rd trial, the story had changed. Prosecutors revealed new forensic evidence showing the shots came from inside the bedroom. The angle, the distance, the silence afterward. They argued that AJ had done it out of anger, frustration, and resentment. He wanted independence. He wanted control. In the courtroom, he wept as the jury watched the 911 recording, where his own voice sounded eerily calm. One juror later said, "It wasn't the crying that convinced us, it was the silence after." When the guilty verdict came in 2023, 7 years after the murders,
"It is now the order of this court that you be sentenced to life."
AJ showed no visible reaction. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. His grandmother still visits him. She insists he is innocent, that something else must have happened that night. His sister, Kyra, has spoken only rarely, but she once said, "I loved my brother, but I also loved my parents. Nothing will ever be the same." For the people of Houston, the Armstrong case became a haunting reminder that wealth and faith do not shield a family from tragedy. Their home was later sold, the rooms repainted, but no one forgets what happened there. The neighbors say the silence on that street still feels heavier than it should. AJ writes letters from prison now, long, thoughtful letters filled with Bible verses and apologies. He tells people he's changed, that God has forgiven him. But forgiveness doesn't erase what's written in blood. And for those who remember Dawn and Antonio Armstrong, peace is something that never arrived. The most chilling part of his story is the moment before the first gunshot. That second of stillness when everything could have been different. He could have walked away. He could have gone back to bed. Instead, he pulled the trigger. And while Texas was still divided over whether AJ was guilty or misunderstood, another boy from Alabama would leave no doubt. A 14-year-old who murdered 5 members of his own family without hesitation. Mason Sisk. It was just after 9 in the evening when the call came in. A small house in Elkmont, Alabama. Shots fired. A child on the phone saying his family was dead. When police arrived, they found a boy waiting outside, shaking, barefoot, his hands covered in someone else's blood. That boy was 14-year-old Mason Sisk. He told the officers a story that sounded rehearsed, that someone had broken in, shot his family, and run off into the night. His voice cracked, but there were no tears. When they asked who did it, he said, "I don't know, they were just gone." But the truth was much darker. There had been no intruder. Mason had pulled the trigger himself. Inside the home, the scene was chaos. 5 bodies. His father, John Sisk, his stepmother, Mary, and his 3 younger siblings, Kane, Colson, and Riley, ages 6, 5, and 6 months. They were found in their beds, shot at close range, each one executed in silence. The weapon was a 9mm handgun taken from the father's nightstand. When police returned to question Mason, his story began to fall apart. He changed details, mixed timelines, slipped on names. Finally, an officer leaned forward and asked softly, "Did you shoot your family, Mason?" There was a long pause, then he whispered, "Yes." He said he had been angry, that his father had grounded him, taken away his phone, and told him he was becoming disrespectful. He said he had thought about killing them for days, that he wanted to know what it felt like. When asked how he felt afterward, he said, "Nothing. I just wanted it to stop." Investigators later found that Mason had shown troubling behavior for years. At school, he bragged about hurting animals. He talked about violence like it was a game. He once told a friend he could get away with murder because he was a kid. No one believed him. No one thought he meant it. The community of Elkmont was shattered. It wasn't a city filled with crime. It was a quiet rural town where families waved from porches and children rode bikes until sunset. The idea that a boy could kill his entire family seemed impossible, but the evidence was overwhelming. Gun residue covered his hands. His footprints led to every room, and his confession, recorded calmly, left no room for doubt. When the details became public, the world wanted to know why. Why would a 14-year-old destroy everything he had? There was no abuse, no drugs, no outside influence, just anger. Small, festering, senseless anger that grew until it demanded release. At trial, Mason appeared emotionless. He sat quietly, watching as prosecutors described how he walked from room to room, reloading between each shot. They said he showed calculated intent, not confusion or panic. He didn't cry when they showed pictures of his siblings. He didn't look away when they played his confession. He just stared. The defense tried to argue that Mason was too young to understand what he was doing, that his brain wasn't fully developed, that it was an act of teenage impulsiveness, not evil. But no one could ignore the precision of the crime, the deliberate steps, the lack of remorse. The jury found him guilty of 5 counts of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Because of his age, the judge said it was the harshest sentence allowed by law. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Mason shook his head. He whispered, "No." For the people of Elkmont, the horror never faded. Friends and relatives still asked themselves what they missed, what signs they should have seen. One family member said, "You never think it will be your own blood. You never think a child can hate like that." The Sisk home stood empty for months. Eventually it was torn down. In its place, only a patch of grass remains, with a small wooden cross where the front door once stood. It reads, "Forever loved, forever lost." Prison records show that Mason rarely speaks to anyone. He keeps to himself, spends most of his time reading or writing letters that no one receives. In one of his few interviews, he said he thinks about his family every day. But when asked if he misses them, he didn't answer. He just looked away. Some crimes are fueled by greed, others by jealousy or desperation. But this one had no reason at all. It was a killing born from emptiness, a kind of darkness that logic can't explain. Because sometimes evil doesn't arrive with motive. Sometimes it just happens. The name Mason Sisk became a ghost that haunts Alabama, a reminder that evil can wear the face of a child and the smile of a son. And for every family who locks their doors a little tighter now, his story is a nightmare that never truly ends. And while Alabama was still recovering from the horror of a boy who killed without reason, another teenager would unleash his rage, turning his home into a battlefield and leaving only blood and silence behind. Ethan Orton. It was after midnight in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The street was quiet, lined with sleeping houses and the faint hum of distant traffic. Inside one of those homes, 17-year-old Ethan Orton sat awake in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. Pictures of birthdays, Christmas mornings, smiles that once meant everything. Within minutes, those memories would turn into ghosts. Ethan was not what anyone would call dangerous. He was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and obedient. He did well in school, volunteered at church, and had never been in serious trouble. But beneath that calm exterior, something was crumbling. He had been struggling with depression for years, a deep, dull sadness that left him detached from reality. He felt worthless, like a burden to everyone who loved him. He believed that ending his life would be a mercy. But before he could do that, he decided on something even darker. He told police later that he believed killing his parents would save them, that he didn't want them to suffer after he was gone. It was the kind of twisted reasoning that only made sense inside a broken mind. His parents, Mindy and David Orton, had spent years trying to help him. Therapy, medication, late-night talks. They had done everything they could to keep their son alive. But on the night of October the 14th, 2021, all of that ended. Ethan waited until his parents were asleep. He went into the kitchen and picked up a large knife. He walked quietly down the hallway toward their bedroom, pausing once at the door. He could hear them breathing, the same sound that had comforted him as a child. He stood there for a long moment, shaking, whispering to himself that it would be quick, that it would be merciful. Then he stepped inside. The first attack was brutal. His mother woke up first, screaming his name, trying to push him away. David tried to fight back, but Ethan was stronger than they expected. He stabbed them again and again, ignoring their cries, until the room fell silent. When it was over, he sat down on the floor, covered in blood, and whispered, "I'm sorry." He later told police he had planned to take his own life afterward, but couldn't go through with it. Instead, he sat beside his parents' bodies for nearly an hour, staring into the dark. Then he walked outside and called 911. His voice was calm, almost empty. He said, "I killed my parents. Please send someone." When officers arrived, Ethan was waiting in the front yard. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't cry. He didn't even ask what would happen next. He simply said, "I did it because I loved them." Inside the house, police found the bodies of Mindy and David Orton in their bed. The walls were splattered with blood. There were signs of struggle, but no signs of hatred. No broken furniture, no chaos, just quiet, deliberate violence. To investigators, it felt less like rage and more like surrender. In interviews, Ethan repeated that he had done it to save them. He said he didn't want them to suffer through his suicide, that he believed this was the only way for them all to be at peace. Detectives listened in disbelief. They had heard confessions before, cold, angry, manipulative. But this was different. This was sorrow turned inside out. Psychologists described his mental state as detached, possibly psychotic. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was an act of love, not murder. But love doesn't stab, and mercy doesn't bleed. The trial was short. Ethan waived his right to a jury and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. He showed no emotion as prosecutors described every wound, every scream, every moment of betrayal. When asked if he understood what he had done, he nodded. When asked if he regretted it, he said, "I do, but it's too late." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed to struggle for words. Before the hearing ended, he said softly, "I hope someday you understand the difference between love and destruction." In prison, Ethan Orton spends most of his time alone. He rarely speaks to anyone. He has no visitors. He told one guard he dreams about his parents every night, not the night he killed them, but the days before, when they still smiled at him across the dinner table. In those dreams, he said, they forgive him. But when he wakes up, the silence feels heavier than ever. The house where it happened was sold after the murders. Neighbors say no one stays long. They say the air inside feels different, cold, distant, like something still lingers. One woman who lived next door told reporters, "You can't walk by that house without feeling like it's watching you." Ethan's story is not one of hate, but of delusion, a reminder that even good intentions can become monstrous when warped by despair. He thought he was saving his parents from pain, but in truth, he only passed it on to everyone left behind. And now, that pain lives on. In an empty home, in a broken family, in the quiet corridors of a prison cell, where a boy waits for forgiveness that will never come. The next killer is not responsible for the death of his own parents, but he did kill a parent, one who trusted him, even welcomed him into her home, despite all of the red flags raised by everyone around. People had warned her, friends had whispered their concerns, teachers had made notes, but kindness can blind even the most careful person, and on that night, compassion cost her everything. It was the night of March the 12th, 2018, in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Inside a quiet home in the gated community of Ballin Isles, a birthday sleepover had settled into silence. The boys were asleep on couches and air mattresses, and the woman who owned the home, Elaine Simon, had gone upstairs to rest. She believed the night was safe. She believed the children under her roof were safe, but one of them was not who he appeared to be. 17-year-old Corey Johnson had been invited by a friend. He was quiet, polite, a boy who rarely caused trouble. But behind that calm surface, something had been changing for months. Investigators later discovered that Corey had been spending long hours online, absorbing extremist ideology, celebrating violence, and isolating himself from anyone who could have stopped him. He had already been flagged multiple times by school officials and law enforcement, but nothing had been done quickly enough to protect the people sleeping beside him that night. As the house grew dark, Corey lay awake. The birthday guest of honor, 13-year-old Giovanni Sierra, slept only a few feet away. Down the hall, Elaine Simon and her younger son Dane were also asleep. The air was calm, still. Nothing hinted at what was coming. Just after midnight, Corey stood up. He walked to the kitchen, he picked up a knife, and then he returned to the living room where the boys were sleeping. Without saying a word, Corey leaned over the birthday boy. 13-year-old Giovanni had no chance to react. The attack was sudden, fast, and brutal. The sounds of struggle woke the others. Dane Simon ran toward his mother, shouting for help as Corey turned the knife on him as well. The boy begged him to stop. Corey stabbed him anyway. Hearing the chaos, Elaine rushed from her bedroom. She saw Corey standing over the children, the knife dripping in his hand. She tried to push him away, tried to protect her son, tried to save the boy who had come to her home for a birthday celebration. Corey stabbed her repeatedly, ignoring every scream, every plea, every moment of courage she showed trying to shield the children under her care. Neighbors later told police they heard the cries for help echoing through the streets. Inside the home, Giovanni Sierra lay dying. Dane and his mother were bleeding, desperately trying to escape. And Corey, the boy they had trusted, kept going with a calmness that chilled investigators long after the night was over. When officers arrived, Corey did not run. He did not fight. He was sitting outside the home, waiting. He told police that he attacked because the victims had, in his mind, offended his beliefs. He claimed he was acting out a form of devotion. Detectives described his statements as cold, emotionless, and deeply disturbed. Inside the house, paramedics found 13-year-old Giovanni dying from multiple stab wounds. Elaine and Dane survived, but barely. Their courage and quick reactions saved their own lives. During trial, prosecutors revealed Corey's months of online radicalization, his obsession with violence, and the repeated warnings sent to the FBI before the attack. Corey sat still and silent as the courtroom heard the recordings, the timelines, the medical details. When asked to speak, he apologized, but experts noted his words felt detached, almost distant from what he had done. The judge called the attack an act of pure evil and sentenced Corey Johnson to life in prison. He was 17 at the time of the killing. Today he lives in a Florida state prison, spending his days alone, far from the families whose lives he shattered. The sleepover home has long since been repaired, repainted, lived in again. But for the families touched by that night, nothing feels the same. A birthday became a nightmare, a friend became an attacker, and a quiet community learned how quickly darkness can enter a home that should have been filled with safety and celebration. And while Florida was left haunted by the boy who brought ideology into his friend's home, destroying this family, another teenager in Texas would soon prove that sometimes evil does not come from belief. It comes from pure rage. Zachary Callens. Texas has seen its share of tragedies, but few were as quiet, as sudden, or as senseless as the one that unfolded inside a modest home in Granbury. No warning, no motive that made sense. Just a 16-year-old boy, a gun, and a silence that would echo forever. Zachary Callens was the kind of teenager neighbors described as polite and reserved. He lived with his parents, Michael and Sharon Callens, in a small brick house on a peaceful street. His family was close, church-going, ordinary. There were no signs of abuse, no record of violence, no whisper of danger. But inside, something was wrong, something no one saw coming. Zachary had been struggling for months. He was moody, restless, angry at rules that felt suffocating. His parents wanted structure, good grades, curfews, responsibility. He wanted freedom. Friends said he sometimes complained that his parents didn't understand him, that they treated him like a child. It sounded like normal teenage frustration, but in Zachary's mind, it was becoming something darker. He began spending more time alone, isolating himself in his room, scrolling endlessly through his phone, ignoring the world around him. He wrote in a private journal about feeling trapped, about wanting everything to stop. His teachers noticed the change, but when they asked if he was okay, he smiled and said he was just tired. No one looked deeper. No one saw the storm coming. On the night of June the 4th, 2014, the Callens family had dinner together. Nothing seemed unusual. They laughed. They talked about school. They said grace at the table like they always did. Then, everyone went to bed. Sometime after midnight, Zachary walked quietly to his father's closet and took out a handgun. He held it for a long time, staring at the cold metal, his reflection faintly visible in the barrel. Then he moved down the hallway. His parents were asleep in their room. He stood in the doorway, breathing hard, the gun trembling in his hands. His father stirred, half awake, and whispered his name. That was the last word he ever spoke. 2 gunshots shattered the silence, then 2 more. When the noise stopped, both of his parents were dead. Zachary stood there for a moment, frozen, watching smoke rise from the barrel. He dropped the gun, sat on the floor, and stared at the wall. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just waited. Minutes passed before he finally realized what he had done, or maybe he always knew. He got up, washed his hands, and went to sit on the porch, where the air was still and heavy. He watched the sun begin to rise over the horizon as if nothing had changed. At dawn, he called 911. His voice was flat. He said, "My parents are dead. I shot them." When officers arrived, they found him sitting on the porch, barefoot, covered in blood. He surrendered without a word. Inside, detectives found a house that looked untouched. 2 plates still in the sink, laundry folded neatly on the couch, a Bible open on the table. It was the kind of home built on love, undone in seconds. When questioned, Zachary showed no emotion. He told investigators he just snapped. He said he didn't hate his parents. He just wanted them to stop controlling him. He admitted he'd thought about it before, but didn't believe he'd ever go through with it. When asked why that night was different, he said, "I don't know. I just decided to do it." Psychologists described him as intelligent, calm, and emotionally detached. He showed signs of depression and repressed anger, but no insanity. He knew what he was doing, and he understood it was wrong. That made it worse. During the trial, the prosecution painted a picture of cold calculation, a son who murdered out of resentment. They described how he'd waited for the right moment, how he'd shot both parents while they slept, how he'd confessed without remorse. The defense argued that he was mentally unstable, that years of quiet pressure had pushed him to the edge. But the jury didn't see a boy on the edge. They saw a killer who planned, executed, and confessed without hesitation. Zachary Callens was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In court, he barely reacted. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he looked down and whispered, "I'm sorry." It was the only time he spoke. The families of Michael and Sharon sat in silence, some holding hands, others shaking their heads, knowing that no sentence could make sense of what he had done. For the people of Granbury, the case was a wound that refused to heal. Neighbors still remember the flashing police lights, the sound of helicopters, the disbelief that something so evil could happen on their quiet street. One neighbor said, "I saw him mow the lawn last week. He waved. He looked normal. He looked like any other kid." The Callens home was sold after the murders. New owners moved in, painted the walls, changed the floors. But the town never forgot. Every time the anniversary passes, flowers appear at the edge of the lawn, a quiet tribute to two parents who never saw their son's darkness until it was too late. From his prison cell, Zachary rarely speaks to the outside world. He reads books, writes letters he never sends, and sometimes tells guards he dreams about his parents. In one of those dreams, he said, his mother forgives him, but when he wakes up, the silence reminds him of what forgiveness can't fix. His story, like so many others, isn't about monsters born evil. It's about ordinary children who turn into something unrecognizable when love becomes a burden. A reminder that sometimes the scariest thing in the world isn't a stranger, it's someone you raised yourself. There are names that fade and names that stain. Every family in these stories believed their love would be enough, until it wasn't. These are not tales of villains, but warnings of how easily humanity can slip away. If there's one thing these cases show, it's that evil doesn't always look like a shadow in the dark. Sometimes it wears a familiar face and whispers goodnight before it kills. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the next story might be closer than you think. Comment below who you believe was the most horrifying case of all time. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, because the darkness never sleeps. There are names that fade and names that stain. Every family in these stories believed their love would be enough, until it wasn't. These are not tales of villains, but warnings of how easily humanity can slip away. If there's one thing these cases show, it's that evil doesn't always look like a shadow in the dark. Sometimes it wears a familiar face and whispers goodnight before it kills. Comment below who you believe was the most horrifying case of all time. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, because the darkness never sleeps. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the next story might be closer than you think.